So the next speaker is Dr. Romain Robbes. He is a senior scientist at CNRS in France. His research interests span across empirical software engineering, mining software repository, and software evolution. Several of his papers has received the Best Paper Award, including ICSE 2020, ICPE 2019, and his paper also received the Most Influential Paper Award at MSR 2020. So today he's going to give us a talk on do language model really understand code. So please.
All right, so thanks, Jack, for the introduction. Okay, so usually when there is a question in a title, I mean, there's a saying that says the answer is always no. Well, let's see if that's really the case. So I just got the idea from David to talk about what was my earliest work on pre-trained model. So that's something we had at ICSE near in 2019. And that means we had to submit it before BERT was on archive. So the general thing is now you know a bit about how foundation models work. But in general, like how they work inside, we don't really know. So what we know is that they're essentially so big matrices, and you have some vectors that go in, a bunch of matrix multiplications, some vectors go out. We call these vector representations. And some years ago, there was a quote by Ray Mooney from NLP. I'll let you fill in the blanks with your internal language model. But basically, he was skeptical of whether it was possible to encode the meaning of a sentence in a single blank vector. And basically then some people decided to figure out so exactly what you can cram into a single blank vector. So one way to do this is to use a technique called probing. So basically what this consists in, I'll just give you like the overall idea. So we know that a foundation model, such as BERT, you see it's a bad drawing, but you can see the layers inside. It learns vector representations of some features of its input. So we can retrieve these vector representations, so that the vectors that it will compute, before doing a prediction. And the idea is that if the model found some features useful, then they should be encoded in the representation that it computes. And if they are encoded in the representation, then so if they are useful and encoded in the representation, then we should be able to detect it. And the idea of this probing paradigm is that the easier it is to detect a given feature, then it means the better the initial representation is. So basically what probing consists in is to have a weak classifier, like a tiny classifier, which should not be able to learn much, and see whether this tiny classifier can learn something from the vector representations extracted from the model. If it can, it means the model has a good representation of the concept we are looking for. One important thing when we do this is that we are not fine-tuning our foundation model. We are just training the probe, the tiny classifier. Because the idea is that we evaluate task-independent representations, so we are interested in what the model learned during its pre-training. So if we do that step by step to make that a bit more concrete, so what you would do is that you would pick a characteristic that we want to investigate. We'll define some kind of diagnostic task that would exhibit this characteristic. We create a data set for this diagnostic task. Then we pass this data set through the model we want to investigate to collect vector representations of how it encodes the data set. Then we train this simple probe classifier on these frozen representations. And then we assess the performance of the probe. And here I put carefully, because this is a technique that is subject to some confounding factors. So you always have to take the results that you have with a grain of salt. In particular, you usually should not trust too much the absolute results that you get, but you can have more confidence in the relative results. Like if you compare two models, if one does better, you can be pretty sure that it is indeed encoding the feature better. So concretely, if you wanted to know if the BERT foundation model encodes the tense of sentence, you would define a diagnostic task, for instance, verb tense classification. You would build a data set of a bunch of examples where you have sentences with different tenses, and you would label them with the actual tense. And the diagnostic task would be to predict the tense of the sentence based on the encoded input. Another variant is that you can have some tasks for which you do some modification of the input. So if you want to know if the BERT model is encoding something that resembles word order, you would define a diagnostic task such as word order detection, where you would build a data set where half of the sentences have their normal order, and the other half, you would swap two words in it. Then you would take these sentences, you would feed them through the BERT model, collect the vector representations, and see if, based on these representations, you can train a tiny classifier that is able to predict if the sentence had its word in the right order or not. So essentially what we did in this paper is we did that with source code models. So basically we defined 15 diagnostic tasks representing source code characteristics. Actually we defined more, but then we cut down to 15. We evaluated 8 source code models plus 1 baseline and investigated 3 research questions on this. So I won't go through the 15 diagnostic tasks. I will just give an example of the tasks in each category. So we had some tasks at the token level where we would take a token, a programming language token, and the task was to identify whether the model is able to recognize whether it's a package name, a class name, a method name, or a variable name. Then we had 2 categories of tasks related to the structure of code. And these essentially were metrics computed on source code fragments. For instance, we had a task where, given a source code fragment, the task was to see if the model is able to count the number of variables in the source code fragment. We also had tasks related to complexity. So we had like 3 different complexity metrics, such as the end-pass complexity, cyclomatic complexity, and so on. And finally, we had tasks that were more related to the semantics. So essentially, these tasks were to see if the model, based on this pre-training only, is able to detect whether some pieces of code have some kind of bugs in them. So for instance, one of the tasks was whether the model is able to recognize that we swapped a comparison operator with an assignment operator in a piece of code. And you also had other tasks and other the type of task where we would switch either identifiers or keywords with other identifiers or keywords. So we defined these 15 tasks, and then we evaluated 8 source code models based on this. So we had a variety of models. We had 4 encoders, 4 encoder-decoders. We didn't do decoders in this study, plus the baseline. So we tried to have like some variety. So I won't go into the details here because that's not, I think, very important, but we had these models. We had CodeBERT, CodeBERTA, Graph CodeBERT, which is interesting because it's trained in a way where it's really source code specific. JavaBERT is also interesting because it's trained only on Java, so we'd expect that it would know a lot about Java. Then we had some encoder-decoders, PLBART, CodeT5, which Satish talked about earlier, UniXcoder, which is trained on also some structure, ASTs, and CodeReviewer, which is trained on code and also diffs. So it's a varied set of models that we looked at. And we also had a baseline, and that one is really interesting, because the baseline is the original BERT model, and that one is trained on Wikipedia and books. That means it's not trained on code. So it should not know about code. And that's a good comparison point. So the question is, can code-specific models do better than this model that doesn't know about code, and if so, by how much? So in terms of research questions, we looked at the overall performance on those tasks. Then we looked at model-specific performance and per-layer performance, because you could get information on all the layers of the model. Although I won't talk much about it because we don't have that much time. So our research questions were essentially, so how well do code models encode the source code characteristics? Do they improve over BERT? And how much? That's in general, so basically looking at the best model. And then we looked at the models separately to see whether some models are better on some code categories and if there is a best model overall, and then whether the performance varies across layers. So here are the results. Well, first, would you have predictions? So, well, we don't have much time, so we'll just share my predictions before running this study. So I thought that the models would encode these source code characteristics. I mean, they should do well. I mean, they're meant to do so. I thought that BERT should not do well. But more precisely, I thought that for some tasks, the tasks that rely on source code identifiers, given that source code identifiers, they have words in English, comparatively, BERT should do better than for the task where we would have to think about the structure of the code. That one should be the ones where BERT is clueless. And then I had a prediction that graph code BERT, of all the models that we had, should be the best because it's the one that is really trained in a way that is the most specific to source code. So those were my predictions. These are the results. It's a big table and it's unreadable, but we did think a lot about the presentation. But to simplify it, let's look at the headline results. So overall performance, which is essentially the performance of the best model across these 8 models on these tasks. And I'll go quickly, but what we see is that the performance is mixed. You have some tasks where the performance is good, some where the performance is decent, and some where the performance is really pretty bad. So some source code characteristics were not encoded successfully by the models. And the interesting thing is, if we look at the baseline, and if we take essentially the difference between the best code model and the performance of BERT, we see that there are some tasks where the source code models, they are much better than BERT. Some where they are somewhat better, and some where they are barely better than BERT. Sometimes it's like almost embarrassing. So there are some tasks where the models, they really do not encode these features well. So here were my predictions. Here is what happened. So I thought the model should do well in these encoding these features. So for some categories of tasks, so the token level and semantic tasks, the performance was good to decent. But for the structural tasks, the models were struggling. And I thought that BERT would be comparatively better with tasks related to identifiers. And actually, kind of the opposite happened. So BERT was kind of worse on the task with identifiers and the semantic of code. And the task where it was comparatively the least bad were the ones that were about code structure, which is the opposite of what I predicted. So if I make a prediction, just don't trust me. That's the thing you should remember from this talk. If we look at the per model performance, here we distilled this in another visualization. Essentially, we rescaled the performance so that 0 would be equal to the performance of BERT. And everything that is gray means a model actually performed worse than BERT. And you can see there's a lot of gray here. So there are lots of models that are supposed to be trained on source code that actually on a lot of tasks are performing worse than BERT. There are like some silver linings. So some models are almost, but not always, doing better than BERT. Sometimes not by much. Like you see some of the numbers here, they are very, very low. So they really crawl past BERT and, you know, like go like a couple of inches farther and that's it. So if we abstract further away, when we compute some kind of ranking, we see that we have two models that are the best by far. Graph code BERT, the one that I predicted, yay. Code BERT is also doing well. Code T5 is also pretty good. And there are really some models down the list that are really, like in general, overall, performing worse than BERT. They're ranked below BERT. So what can we make of this? So we see some categories of model performing better. We see that graph code BERT is the best model. I won't talk about this, but you have some nice pictures and nice patterns that you can briefly look at. So to conclude, so some implication was that BERT was a surprisingly strong baseline, but that was really because the models themselves were unexpectedly weak. Training data has some influence. It's not obvious because the Java-only model, because we are using Java, was one of the worst. You could expand this study to a lot of more characteristics. And one hypothesis is that the pre-training objective is very important. But there is still a long way to go because the performance was far from amazing. We didn't look at models such as GPT, but that's a great question for later. So if we look at this quote, and that's the last slide. So we had this quote by Ray Mooney, and if we update it, so far you can cram the meaning of a whole Java method in a single vector, especially the structural information. And that quote is not from Ray Mooney, but it's from Anjan Karmakar, my former student, and myself. That's it.
All right. Thanks, Roman, for the wonderful talk.